really great to have you back with us today because we've got a really good opportunity to unpack a very interesting, I might call disrupting publication book that's just been produced by our guest today, Sam Roggeveen. Really great to have you with us, Sam.
Thanks.
Sam's been a long-standing member of the Lowy Institute, but again, in a bit the same sort of theme as we've had with other guests, as they've moved into academic or analytical spaces, they actually have an underpinning of practical application to their expertise. And in particular, Sam is formerly in what was the Office of National Assessments, now is the Office of National Intelligence that Andrew Shearer heads. So great to have you with us, Sam. Now, this book that you've produced, The Strategic Echidna.
The Echidna Strategy?
Echidna Strategy, that's right, yes. It's interesting in that a lot of the commentary and discussion that's gone on around the traps has assumed a certain level of threat that China poses that has to be countered. Nobody's really had a crack from the government point of view of unpacking what that might be. Are we actually trying to protect Australia from invasion, or is it just strangulation, stopping up our sea lanes, etc.? What is this threat? So in your book, you've really kind of unpacked that with a lot of analytics on the actual capacity the Chinese have, but also where they're going with that capacity. So can you summarize for us what you see as the actual threat from China?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Well, first of all, there's no question about the scale of China's military modernization so far and the ambitions that they have for the future. So I think the way I put it in the book is that they have engaged in probably the most dramatic, far-reaching modernization of any military force since the Second World War, and yet in budgetary terms, they're barely breaking a sweat. So most experts, there's debate about this, but most experts, at least the reputable ones that I rely on, would say that they're spending a little over 2% of GDP on defense.
Right.
The Americans, by comparison, spend about 3.5%, just under 3.5%. So they have, over the last 30 years, really probably since 1991 is when it began in earnest, they have engaged in this massive modernization and very thorough modernization of their military. And yet, like I say, in budgetary terms, they're barely breaking a sweat. So there's no question about, at least in my mind, of trying to minimize the scale of what China has achieved. And by the way, the ceiling remains very, very high. And just over the last 6 months or so, I have, I think, revised my own assumptions about the pace and scale of modernization, particularly when it comes to aerospace, because they've released a couple of we've started seeing pictures now emerging online of 6th-generation fighter designs, which place them now equal to or even slightly ahead where the United States is, and certainly ahead of where the Russians and the Europeans are in terms of technological sophistication.
Especially now for the Russians, they're
Indeed.
slightly degraded.
Yes, indeed. So, if anything, I'm revising upwards about the scale and pace of Chinese military modernization. Now, with all that said, Australia's a long way away from China, but Beijing's closer to Berlin than it is to Sydney.
Right.
And again, as I argue in the book, distance is Australia's single biggest strategic asset, and that's because
there's the gap.
As you know, Mike, the further away you are, the harder it is to project military power of any significance. So projecting military force over huge distances imposes massive economic and logistical and engineering costs that you don't have to face when you're operating at very close distances. And China's ability to close that distance, to compress that distance between us and Australia is still extremely limited.
Right.
And so the chapter of the book that you're referring to really tries to pull apart in detail, well, what is it at the moment that the Chinese could throw at us? So invasion is out of the question. And even in the medium to long-term future, it's absolutely out of the question because Australia is so large, it would be so difficult to do. I think it's actually even beyond the United States to do it, honestly, because Australia is so far away, so large, and would be very difficult to occupy for an enemy power.
And you sort of unpacked the capacity there in like 40,000 Marines and
it's not nowhere near enough.
And the fact that they'd have to be throwing, and this isn't the case if they were throwing everything at
exactly
mission, and whether they could actually just dedicate the entire resources of the PLA and Navy and Air Force to that task.
And it's hard to imagine circumstances where you would devote the entire PLA to that task. Like, what is it about Australia that's so important that you would throw all those resources at it? It's hard to imagine that ever being true.
And try and sustain it.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. And if your answer is, well, Australia's natural resources are worth taking, then I would argue that it's far cheaper to buy them than to try to steal them, right? Or to try to invade to take them. It's much less trouble and it's much easier. And Australia has a very open economy where our natural resources can be purchased at market prices, and you're better off going down that path than taking the much more aggressive path. Hard to see circumstances in which Australia would ever cut off supplies of iron ore, for instance. We'd be spiting our, cutting our nose to spite our face. So, okay, invasion's off the table. So what else? Well, there are other ways to militarily coerce Australia to get Australia to do what you want. You mentioned one in passing, that is trying to isolate Australia economically. There's also the possibility of air and missile strikes on Australian territory and on Australian bases and even on Australian cities. And then, of course, there's a possibility of nuclear strikes on Australia in a supreme emergency. Now, for various reasons that we can get into, I think, those things, they're unlikely, but even if they were to occur, they're not catastrophic for Australia. They're not catastrophic scenarios. And they are things that it is within Australia's power to actually, if not fully prevent military threats of that kind, then to at least absorb that damage and to minimize the damage, and also to cause enough pain, enough damage to the adversary, namely China, that it's not worthwhile to do it.
Just to unpack that a little bit as we go here, the Australian Navy is really dependent on the N44 resources coming from overseas. Almost our entire refined oil product's got to come through those sea lines. So wouldn't it be severely constricting for us and, really put a damper on both our military capacity and our economy at the same time that would at least help them to achieve a political outcome, if not completely crippling us over the long time and being able to sustain that? Isn't that a critical vulnerability for us, that particularly like the refined oil product that comes across those sea lanes?
Well, I'll interrogate that argument in a moment, but I think the first thing to say is, if you're right about that, then that Australia is highly vulnerable to the interdiction of oil and other energy supplies, then that's all the more reason to develop more indigenous capacity, more refining capacity on shore, more storage capacity on shore, or B, and I'd say this is sort of the gold medal solution, wean ourselves off fossil fuels as quickly as we can and electrify our transport fleet to the maximum extent possible. We're not doing either of those things at the moment to the extent that we could.
Yeah, that last point really strikes home to me, because when I was Minister for Defence Material, I was really concerned about this energy security issue. And at that time, we'd had our Clean Energy Future package introduced in government. And that was enabling a company called Algae Tech to team up to produce this new biofuel option, where at the same time you strap a facility like this next to, like, say, the Bayswater power station, these mega coal-fired power stations. You could suck 100% of the emissions from those power stations to generate this biodiesel, which is only 26% of the emissions of the fossil fuel variety. But you can have them anywhere, because you don't need to have them with the fast breeder sort of situation of sucking in all that carbon, because this algae really thrives on carbon. And you could have had a distributed network of that as well, which make it less vulnerable to attack, but also doing ourselves a huge favour on reducing emissions, but making ourselves independent, because that biofuel that we're producing was a straight drop-in, no blending or conversion of to a diesel engine, right? So they were doing a pilot project with the Bayswater Power Station. It was all looking great. I took Defence Science and log crew down there and to the facility in Nowra, and we were going to adopt a policy of sort of fast following if we get the US to certify these fuels, and that all fell apart when they tore up the Clean Energy Future Package. And to me, the added benefit to that is that one of the big vulnerabilities of the world today is the private oil revenue, the petrodollars that go into funding terrorist groups and radical madrasas, etc., that keeps Iran in the game on doing what they've been doing. So, I think that last point is actually quite an important one to be made. So, appreciate that.
Yes, and of course the key here is to make new technologies of the kind you're describing commercially viable.
Yes.
And one way you do that, of course, is by introducing carbon tax.
Yes.
But enough said on that topic.
Yeah, or at least, sort of removing the things that mitigate against competition, fair competition. Right. And there's a lot of subsidies that were at play there. But this looked like being a viable economic project, and it was tearing up the Clean Energy Future Package that made it all fall over.
Yeah. But look, just to take on a bit further the question of vulnerability, the vulnerability of Australia's trade routes. Again, geography helps us a great deal here. Not only are we far away, but the continent is so massive and our cities so widely dispersed that the resources that would have to be devoted to a kind of a comprehensive blockade of Australia would need to be massive and would far outweigh the benefit that you could hope to achieve from it. And then I guess the other point, so, for instance, even if you manage to blockade one port or two ports in Australia for an indefinite period, that still leaves a handful of others, which means that, okay, Australia is restricted, but it kind of limps along. I guess the other point to make here is a historic one, that it's difficult to find examples of where nations have been brought to heel by economic blockades alone. Okay, so even putting aside the logistical difficulty of blockading Australia, let's say you could do it,
and refueling aircraft and all that.
What is it? What policy goal do you think you could aim to get by doing that? Right? Could you coerce Australia by blockading us? I mean, the history of warfare in the 20th century, which is a period where warfare was directed more and more towards the population rather than armed forces, that history suggests that when military forces used against population, either directly by bombing or indirectly through blockades, it tends to have a rally around the flag effect. People tend to support the government even more than they did before, rather than, suddenly crumbling in their morale and saying, well, you've got to sue for peace now. So, there are all sorts of barriers, I think, to this idea that Australia can somehow be coerced because of its trade routes, the vulnerability of its trade routes.
Right. And then you get the next level of conversation. So Taiwan and what level of conflict might be associated with that, of course, and the potential to escalate into that nuclear realm you're talking about. And I suppose there might be a situation in that scenario where if we were participants in that, or even if we weren't, but we were basing situations or other support arrangements here that were supporting the US, that some of those sites could become isolated targets, right, rather than the whole of the Australian mainland. So do you see that as a potential risk in that circumstance where we are participating in operations related to Taiwan?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two plausible scenarios in which China could direct military force against Australia, and I think you've hit on one of them. And Australia, I think, unfortunately, has made things worse for itself over the last few years with the decisions that this government has taken on that question. So two separate but related initiatives. One is the so-called SURF West, Submarine Rotational Force West, which is part of AUKUS, the AUKUS arrangement. And Submarine Rotational Force West means that up to 4 American attack submarines are going to be based at HMAS Sterling in Western Australia. I say based. The government never uses that term, but for
support,
rotating, stationed, but they don't use the word base. There are some good legal international legal reasons not to say the word based, but for want of a better term, we'll say based. The second initiative that the government announced separately, not formally part of AUKUS, but I would say, let's say contiguous with AUKUS, is that the RAAF base at Tyndall is going to be expanded so that American B-52 and B-2 and in future B-21 strategic bombers can operate out of there. So these two initiatives together mean that for the first time since the Second World War, America will have assets in Australia that can conduct wartime missions, operational missions from Australian soil. And that means they're going to be targets, right? So in effect, to me, the shorthand logic here is that we are implementing AUKUS in order to address the security threats created by AUKUS, right? It's a self-licking ice cream. I would argue we shouldn't have done this in the first place, and it would remove one obvious reason why China would ever attack Australia in the first place. Seems to me we can get into this separately, the other reason why China might attack Australia is that if in future Australia decides, and it would be a very different world to the one we're in now, if Australia ever decided to develop nuclear weapons, then I think in Chinese eyes, we would become a kind of rogue state in the way that Iran is a rogue state to the United States right now. If that ever happened, if Australia were ever to show signs that we are developing nuclear weapons, I think there's a good chance China would attack us.
Right. And so coming back to the decision you said the government have made, so is it just the AUKUS sort of suite of things, or are there other decisions you'd point to that have been what you wouldn't praise?
Yeah.
So,
well, look, yeah, my primary point of criticism of this and the previous government is AUKUS, and particularly, specifically the submarine deal.
Right.
There's a so-called Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is about various different kinds of exotic technologies with military applications. I have no objections to that. I think it seems to be a very sensible initiative. On Pillar 1 of AUKUS, of course, is the submarine capability, which is the agreement for Australia to introduce 8 nuclear-powered submarines. 3 or maybe 5 of them are going to be American Virginia class, and then the other 3 or maybe 5 are going to be a new class of British designed submarines with a lot of American content and Australian content as well.
Yeah. So this is the thing. I'm closely personally interested in this because when I was Minister for Defence Material, we produced the Future Subs and Industry Shipbuilding Plan in March 2013. So we were planning to move straight into a new conventional phase of submarine. We'd done a lot of work from 2007. Firstly, we were required to remediate the failure to sustain and maintain the fleet we had, and threw $700 million straight at that. But we did the military off-the-shelf service life extension analysis for the Collins and worked out a way ahead in the end. It took time because it does for a submarine. And and it was either going to be sort of a son of Collins or an evolved sort of platform that we would have had a head start on.
Yes.
And we'd already committed $250 million on things like, we're planning to build this shore-based propulsion testing facility, and we'd already down-selected the AN/BYG-1 US combat system.
Yes.
So we could have been already deploying these submarines right now, right?
Yeah.
And to me, I was looking at something that would fill a gap, because I believed by mid-century, I believed at that time, that we would be seeing a lot of underwater systems arriving that were uncrewed. And at that time, I felt it would be absolutely necessary to do that, because the ability for the submarines to be stealthy in those environments would be deteriorating, particularly in the littoral areas and change detection technology, etc. So instead, we messed around. We trashed that plan and the money that had been spent. We went with, we've started messing around with Japanese, French, options, and now coming back to this nuclear thing. But, what worries me is that, we're going to be mixing Collins and, Virginia, and then we got this other, the training issue and the management of all these different platforms is going to be horrendously challenging if it happens.
yeah.
But I'm not sure we'll actually even get to that 2030s beyond sort of scenario, because technology may evolve too quickly. But there is that other part, as we've referred to, the rotation of Allied submarines through. And this brings me to this other point, right? When we're looking at China, we've had conversations with Peter Jennings, and we talked about the mentality and the psychology of Xi Jinping. And what is it that would deter China? And thinking that he probably wouldn't be deterred by a significant loss of human life, for example, in seizing Taiwan. What would really deter him is the risk of failure. And sending strong messages from every moment now through to the timelines we're looking at where people suppose this may happen, isn't the rotational support arrangements for British and US submarines an element of that deterrence, sending that strong signal? Or do you think it wouldn't achieve that, and just break makes us more of a target? Is that your...
Well, it certainly makes us more of a target. That would be worth it if we felt that deterring China from a Taiwan invasion was a vital national interest for Australia. My own question is that I don't think it is a vital national interest for Australia. For the sake of the Taiwanese people, I very much would prefer that China never invaded Taiwan. It is certainly a vital interest for them. And even it's important for the Japanese. Arguably, it's important for the United States, although I have real doubts about the arguments that say that America should be prepared to fight a war over Taiwan, because that could very well become World War III. And so the stakes are very high. And, you'd better be sure that something really important is at stake if you're prepared to fight World War III over it. I'm not sure Taiwan crosses that threshold.
Right.
So like I say, I hope it never happes, but certainly for Australia, I don't think it's a vital national interest.
But
now,
in terms of maybe deterring it from happening in the first place, don't we have an interest in that? Or
we certainly have an interest in it not happening, but I'm not sure that there's a difference between deterring China and being prepared to fight China, because unless the enemy believes that you are prepared to fight, then deterrence will fail, right?
It has to be credible.
It has to be credible. You can bluff, and a bluff might work, and Australia could contribute in a marginal way to that kind of a bluff, but I'm not sure that's worth the risk. Right. So, but the question of resolve is really the key to this. The balance of power is very material as well, and that is shifting very rapidly as which is where we began. Chinese military modernization is extremely rapid, and the balance of power across the Taiwan Strait has shifted dramatically over the last 20 years and continues to do so.
And in your book, you talk about the effective coercion China's being able to exercise against its near neighbours in that realm, or at least the extra caution near neighbours are having to take in that context.
Yes, and I think there's already, you could argue that China is already developing a sphere of influence on mainland Southeast Asia, particularly Cambodia and Laos, where, which lean much more in Beijing's direction than they used to, simply because of the economic and military weight that China can exercise against relatively weak countries. And also because the United States is not a serious counterbalance on the continent of Southeast Asia. The Americans basically said to themselves after Vietnam, never again, we're not going to fight a land war in Asia. So the Chinese have a much freer hand there. And to a certain extent, that mentality, I think, influences the balance of power on the Taiwan Strait as well. There is an imbalance of resolve across the Taiwan Strait. One side wants it much more than the other, right? And that makes your threats, that makes your deterrent power less credible, because it's simply not important enough for the United States, in my view. It's not important enough for the United States to make major sacrifices on Taiwan's behalf. And actually, I think Ukraine has offered Taiwan some sobering lessons there. So the parallels are really strong, actually. You had a nuclear-armed great power invading a neighbor, And what did the United States do in response? It sent weapons. It offered diplomatic support. It imposed fairly crippling sanctions, certainly historically high sanctions, but it did not send troops. It did not directly intervene. And I think the Taiwanese would be crazy if they didn't learn a really vital lesson from that.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting comparison there, actually. We know that the Biden administration knew an invasion was coming in Ukraine. And there's been some thought that, similar to Kennedy's position with Cuba, if the US had come out and said, look, any attack on Ukraine will be considered as an attack on the United States, even though they're not part of NATO, that he would have prevented the invasion in the first place. And the US has followed a strategy, though, in relation to Taiwan of strategic ambiguity in the past to keep the Chinese guessing and on the wrong foot. Where would, say, an equation where you make a clear statement that any invasion of Taiwan would be considered an attack on the US, what would you think would be the strategic risk around adjusting your position to that?
Well, the reason not to do it is really the same for both Taiwan and for Ukraine. The reason you don't do it is because you don't regard the defense of either place as being a vital national interest of something you're prepared to fight a major war over. So ultimately, the reason the Americans didn't offer that kind of guarantee to Ukraine is because the prospect of potentially having to fight a nuclear war against Russia was didn't balance up against the advantages that could be gained from defending Ukraine. So if Ukraine really was a vital national interest for America, it would have been a NATO member long before the Russians invaded, right? It's not that the Russians invaded and suddenly you discover Ukraine is a vital national interest. That can't be right. You know, it had to have been a vital national interest for America all along. And the fact that Ukraine wasn't a NATO member just revealed the fact that the Americans were not prepared to make the kind of sacrifices and take the kind of risks that would be required for this Russian invasion. And I think the same is true of Taiwan. So, in order to offer that kind of a blanket guarantee to Taiwan, you would have to convince yourself that Taiwan is so important to you that you're prepared to fight a nuclear war. Right. And I don't think that statement survives rational analysis. Taiwan is important, but it's not that important.
Right. I guess that then sort of leads to, I guess one thing that could be said, like this book has really zeroed in particularly on China and the nature of its threat. But I tend to look at China in the context of what I call the rectangle of rat bags, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea in particular, and they have kind of satellites around that. But they're the ones that are all nuclear, sort of equipped in terms of weaponry. And they are all coordinating and collaborating so tightly now. There's lots of interests in there, like how you bust sanctions and how you sustain each other in conflict and how you pursue, in particular, information warfare, which has been highly coordinated. And really, I think this began, this kind of really began after the success the Russians displayed in how they influenced the US elections in 2016. And these other players then realizing, that's a pretty cheap way of getting what you want. And it's succeeded to an extent. And we'll come back to this, the Trump factor here. But really, isn't there another level that we have to look at here, which is the way there's this concerted effort to undermine, corrode us from within, never mind military confrontation? And shouldn't this be a higher priority, for example, in AUKUS Pillar 2, in looking for some of the technical ways to combat how they're actually setting elements against each other in our societies, the deepfake AI stuff? I know there's some DARPA projects along these lines. Isn't that something we should be prioritizing in this context? Or,
I mean, I'm operating slightly, let's just say at least at the very edge of my expertise on this subject, if not slightly outside it.
Right.
But I just offer the opinion that at the heart of this rests, it seems to me, for Western countries and for Australia specifically, is a question about the strength and resilience of our own democracy. And so quite apart from specific measures that we should be taking to dilute or the effectiveness of the kind of information warfare methods that you're talking about, at the heart of it is a question of how much faith do you have that Australians can withstand this kind of campaign, and through our through the freedoms and through the liberties that we have, that kind of messaging can be counteractive. I'm still pretty optimistic in that regard.
Right.
One of the reasons I'm optimistic actually is research that the Lowy Institute undertook a few years ago about the Chinese community, the ethnic Chinese community in Australia, which and there was some alarmism around a few years ago about the influence of Chinese apps on Chinese speaking Australians, right? And the kind of information they were getting.
Yeah, WeChat.
And also, WeChat, but also traditional media. So a lot of Chinese language newspapers and Chinese language radio stations were being bought up by companies and entities which had clearly had a relationship with the Chinese state and was the Chinese Communist Party. And that's an issue. That's been an issue in New Zealand and around the Pacific Islands region as well. But what our research found is that Chinese people in Australia were very aware of the limitations of things like WeChat and of the kind of biases that were present there. And although they were using those services heavily, they were supplementing them with other
services as well. Yeah.
So to me, a big part of the answer to the kind of threats that you're talking about is freedom, and about the resilience of the Australian system that comes through the liberties that we have and the access that we have to open sources.
Right. We might come back to that point in the next program, because I think there's some other dimensions to that I'd like to see if you have an opinion on. I know it's kind of on the edges of your focus, but I think it's worth having a little bit of a conversation around that and the nature of the threat of China. So it's great having you here, Sam. We'll look forward to continuing this conversation in the second part of this program. But thanks for being with us. And it really is a challenging time when we have to work through what is being told to us about what the threats are and really understanding what they are and what's the best way to approach them. And in the next program, we're particularly going to look at what Sam's suggesting the Australian position should be in this. So we'll see you again next time. Cheers.